Hi everyone, welcome to Denman's Den. I'm Kathy Denman, and today I want to share something deeply personal with you. Some of you know, but many of you don't, that when I was about 41 years old, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Now, at that time, it was extremely early in the diagnosis, and I only needed to take one little pill, and it was just a fraction of the pill, actually. And I was able to go for quite a few years with just that little bit of medicine, and the only movements that I had were with my legs, and they were well controlled with that medication. And then when I got into my mid-50s, I noticed that I had to go back to the doctor and get that medication increased until it reached the point where I was at the maximum dose of that medication. But then these past 4 or 5 years, things have become much more difficult. And especially in this year of 2026, I have been struggling with sleeplessness and restless movements of my arms, my legs, my head. I've fallen probably more this year than I've ever fallen in my entire life. Things tire me out now, not just physically, but emotionally as well. And depression comes with this illness, and I've been crying a lot lately and isolating myself from friends and loved ones. And, I've been sharing broadcasts on YouTube about peace, and I've been talking about it not very much from a personal perspective, but more of an intellectual perspective. And some of it has been from personal knowledge and experience, but I am now in a position where I'm asking myself, how do I find rest when I have a body that never rests? And, that's become the big question of my life, especially in this past couple of weeks. And I have come to recognize that peace is not necessarily something still and tranquil and quiet. Peace is sometimes restless, and it moves, and it's kind of an ongoing process. It's not something that can be achieved permanently. At least that's what I'm realizing. And so thus the title of my reflection today is finding rest within a restless body. And I say finding because I will never graduate to found. I believe that I will always be finding that rest. It is a process that I will live for the rest of my life. I want to explore with you and with myself, what does that mean to rest? And again, especially in a body that won't rest. And so what I'm learning is that resting in this case, it's not like what we usually think about when we think of resting. We think of lying down and being still and quiet and not moving very much. But unfortunately, that's not my experience most of the time. So I am discovering and continuing to understand that resting in this case is more like when I would fall down and hurt myself as a child, or when somebody would bully me or say something, to hurt me or push me down or something like that, and I would run to my mother and she would hold me and comfort me. And I was still crying, I was still hurting, I was still upset, or whatever the case may be. But I remember feeling a kind of a sense of resting in her arms, because I felt safe there and I knew that she loved me and that I loved her. And so even though I was still crying and the emotions of the situation were still very much going on and I was, hurting still, I felt that sense of restfulness in her arms. And that sense of restfulness reminds me of something that St. Augustine wrote in his Confessions. When I went to seminary, I had a church history professor who was a deep lover of St. Augustine, and he was quite an expert on his work and his writings and his theology, and we spent a lot of time in our church history class, for which I'm deeply grateful, studying Augustine. And a quote that will always stick with me, it might actually be one of his most famous, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And I think he was talking about, if I may be so bold, to compare that to this image I have of being held in the arms of my mother when I was hurting. It seems to me that that's the kind of rest Augustine is talking about, that we find rest in the midst of our restlessness, in the arms of a loving God. And that, I think, is how I am coming to process, and still on the road and journey to discovering what it means to rest, even though my body is always restless. And it doesn't mean removing the pain or being completely still and quiet. It means being held. It means being in a relationship, being in the presence of someone who loves you, being held by that presence and being in a relationship with that presence. And of course, for me, that relationship and that presence is Jesus Christ. And I don't know what it would be for you that are listening to me, but whatever it is, that to me is what Augustine meant by our hearts being restless until they rest in God, or in that loving presence. And one of the other things that occurred to me about myself is that I have now a new understanding of a particular chapter in the Gospel of John that I had talked about in another reflection that I had done a while back about Jesus and Nicodemus, and in John chapter 3. And Nicodemus came to Jesus wanting a relationship with him, but he came in the middle of the night, or in the third or fourth watch of the night, which would have been around 3 o'clock in the morning, because he wanted invisibility and he wanted to control the parameters of the relationship he was going to have with Jesus, whom he was very interested in knowing, and did believe that he was someone whose calling came from God. And I am discovering that I'm more like Nicodemus than I've ever been willing to or wanted to admit. When it comes to the Parkinson's, that's the thing that began to show me just how much I try to control the visibility of this illness, so that I take medicine before I'm going to go in public so that people won't see the movements. I am teaching an English class right now twice a week, and I'm taking medicine right before I go so I don't move around as much, not wanting others to see it, wanting to hide the extent of the illness from them, and trying to sort of control and manage the perceptions of others. And in the same way that Nicodemus was trying to control the relationship that he wanted to have or was hoping to have with Jesus. And the truth is, what Jesus told Nicodemus, he used the imagery of the wind. A person that's born of the Spirit is it's like the wind. The wind blows where it wills, Jesus said, and you hear the sound of it, but you don't know where it's coming from or where it's going. And being born of the Spirit is the same way. It's not something you can control. And in the same way that Nicodemus was wanting to control the relationship he had with Jesus, and how others saw him in relationship with Jesus, I am doing the same thing, trying to control how others see me in the midst of this illness. And Jesus' response to Nicodemus, he doesn't allow Nicodemus to be sort of closed in by the coming in the third watch of the night. He doesn't allow Nicodemus to sort of categorize him as what he said at the beginning of the chapter. I know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do the things that you do and not come from God. Wanting to put a label on him to sort of control the whole situation. And Jesus takes that control away and opens up the space by using the wind as an example. I mean, the wind has no space. When it's windy, it's windy without a beginning or an end or a direction that we can only see if a flag is blowing in the wind or something like that. And I've often told people when I was a chaplain, but I never really understood it until now, that life is really lived in that big space between things. In the case of Nicodemus, Jesus was trying to tell him that your relationship with God is like that. It's not something you can hem in. It's in that big wide space that's represented by the wind. And I've told people, that's where life is really lived, in the spaces between things. Not just between birth and death, but between guilt and grace, between brokenness and wholeness, between knowing and not knowing, between absence and presence, and between the visible and the invisible. And just like Nicodemus, it seems to me that I and so many other people are in too big of a rush to close that space, and rather than keep it open. And what I haven't realized until now, and what I think it might help all of us to think about, is that when we try to close space rather than keep it open, we close the space where life is truly lived, in that in-between space. And I think that's why so many people are just going through the motions, and they're not really, living their lives. Another place where I felt myself growing and thinking more deeply about myself and my life is in the process of aging. I'm now in my 70s, and I've been reflecting that in that in-between space that I've been sharing about, I didn't want to live anywhere near the other end of that in-between space. When I was a younger person, I felt that I was strong enough to do whatever I wanted to do. I felt that I was independent and could make my own decisions and do, the work that I did, and go to school and raise my child, and everything that I was able to do, I did pretty much on my own. And I also felt that, I needed to have the certainty of a job and an income and a family and, friendships, and, just kind of, as my son used to say to me when he was a little boy, he'd get up in the morning and say, "Okay, Mom, what's the plan for the day?" And, that would be kind of my way of looking at life. And as the perfectionist that I was at the time, I, had to have everything organized and my ducks in a row, pretty much. And so I would want to avoid weakness and dependence and uncertainty. And now, in my 70s, I'm realizing that I'm definitely in that in-between space between independence and dependence. There are some things I can still do independently of help, and there are some things I can no longer do without help. And as far as strength and weakness, I am still able to drive a car and, carry my groceries, and I have strength still in many ways. I still have my intellectual strengths, but I also have a great deal more weakness than I ever did. And I'm definitely in the in-between of strength and weakness right now, and having to face and realize that both are a part of my life. And that's also true of, this plan for the day, and having to have certain certainties that I could depend on in my life. I don't have that much certainty anymore about how things are going to be health-wise. I don't have certainty about income. Kind of living in retirement is an adventure in that regard. And, my days aren't routine anymore, so there's an uncertainty about what each day brings as well. So, and again, much closer now to the end of life than to its beginning, and so there's an uncertainty about how that will work itself out in time. And so I'm in these times of real in-betweenness as I enter into this last chapter of my life. And I had just mentioned perfectionism. And I think, I just need to admit that's always been an issue for me. When I was a child, it was a way to avoid the discomfort of making mistakes and other people's displeasure at my mistakes, and so I would just determine not to make any if possible, and I think that I also was raised in an era and a time when it was taught that showing vulnerability and too much emotion and weakness, it was not acceptable. So I had to be the strong one and not show it if I was not feeling that way. And so that created another kind of perfectionism. And the Apostle Paul, in his second epistle to the Corinthians, the very last chapter, he was asking God to remove what he called a thorn in the flesh, which, whatever it was enough painful that he was struggling to live with it. And the distinct message that he got from the result of his prayers was, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made complete in your weakness." And Paul does not say that means that he should be strong. That wasn't God's message to him, but that he needed to understand that when he was weak, he could rest in the arms of God, who would be strong to love him and be present with him in the midst of his weakness. That's what my strength is made complete in your weakness. If it made me realize if I was always perfect and always strong, I would be very lonely and isolated, more than I feel when I'm depressed even. And that would be because I'm trying to be something I'm not. I'm not perfect, and I'm not invulnerable. I am weak sometimes, and much of the time anymore, it seems like. And yesterday was Mother's Day here in Mexico as well as in the United States. It happened that this year it fell on the same day. That doesn't happen very often, but it did this year. And I had an opportunity to let go of my perfectionism and tendency to want to control the amount of vulnerability that I show by, in the midst of not doing very well with the Parkinson's and with the depression, to get in the car and go visit some friends of mine that are mothers like I am, and to spend some time together with them. I even stopped at a vendor on the way and bought 4 roses, one for my friend and one for her daughter and one for her daughter-in-law, and actually one in memory of her other daughter that passed away. I also received phone calls from my son and my grandchildren, and it just those ordinary activities of a Mother's Day. I found something so sacred about getting out and reaching out and doing that. I realized, often the most sacred things in life are the most ordinary things. And I've been missing that because I'm always trying to be extraordinary, to be perfect. And so, as I close my thoughts for this presentation today, I want to just say that, my life has been experienced through the lens of being widowed young, losing a mother young, losing my dad eventually, losing my brother recently, and he was a bit younger, several years younger than I am, and so it was hard to lose him. And then years and years of being a chaplain to the sick and the dying, and in those experiences, I witnessed what I would consider the full circle of life. And I think of it as the same point on the circle. From the womb, the darkness of the womb, we're born into the light of this current life that we're in. And then as time winds down and it's time for us to die, we enter into what I call the darkness of the womb of the tomb, and move into a new kind of light, the light of the life in the spirit, which is, for me anyway, from my belief system, is in eternity. And so all of this is to say that finding rest within a restless body like I have, it doesn't mean that my movements and my trembling and my restlessness stops. It does mean that in the midst of my restlessness and my trembling and my movements, that I'm being held by the presence of love. For me, the presence of God. And Jesus' imagery of the wind is a good one, because the wind is always moving. It doesn't rest. We're always moving through life in different ways. And maybe what I'm learning, and maybe what I get to share with all of you that might be somewhat helpful, is that resting can be something that happens within the restlessness and the movements of life. And so that's why I always close my broadcasts with "Listen for the wind," because The wind is always moving, and the wind of the Spirit moves through us, surrounds us, and holds us in the midst of our restlessness. We can rest in that love. Thanks for letting me share with you today. And don't forget to listen for the wind.